My story. My brother turned my life into hell. Episode 1. Introduction and Childhood Struggles. My brother turned my life into hell. He got my wife pregnant, and our son turned out not to be mine. Later, he came crawling back to me after our parents disowned him and left me their entire $2 million inheritance. I have a younger brother, Caleb, who has hated me his whole life. If you think it's because of jealousy, you're wrong. I wasn't the favorite child, that was him. So he had no reason to be jealous. My mom always spoiled my younger brother. He was the golden child in our family. She cooked for him, washed his clothes while I had to do everything myself. She even made me help him with his schoolwork, just because he was family, but I never got that kind of treatment. I came to terms with it since I was pretty independent. Maybe that was my mistake, indulging his whims without expecting anything in return. Caleb never helped me when I needed it and only reached out when he wanted something. I was a quiet, introverted kid who loved studying and keeping to myself while he was a carbon copy of our dad, rude and loud. I also got used to speaking directly and honestly, without sugarcoating things, which might be why my mom formed a negative opinion of me from childhood. In the end, it was the family favorite. I didn't care much about that while we were growing up, but the problem started when he found ways to torment me. He teased me about my height or for wearing glasses, sneak into my room to read my personal diary. I'd yell at him and complain to our parents about him violating my boundaries, but they'd laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. Caleb never helped me when I needed it and only reached out when he wanted something. I was a quiet, introverted kid who loved studying and keeping to myself, while he was a carbon copy of our dad, rude and loud. I also got used to speaking directly and honestly, without sugarcoating things, which might be why my mom formed a negative opinion of me from childhood. In the end, he was the family favorite. I didn't care much about that while we were growing up, but the problem started when he found ways to torment me. He'd tease me about my height or for wearing glasses, sneak into my room to read my personal diary, and then complain to mom about what I wrote. I'd yell at him and complain to our parents about him violating my boundaries, but they'd laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. Caleb did worse things, like nearly breaking my glasses or putting nasty stuff in my food. Once, he put pebbles in my porridge. Luckily, I noticed them before they could damage my teeth. I told mom, but she brushed it off, saying, "That's how brothers bond." Every time we fought, Caleb insulted me, deliberately targeting all my insecurities. We went to the same school, and he knew I was being bullied by a few classmates. Instead of supporting me, he joined them, calling me a freak, a loser, or a hairy monkey, even encouraging them to physically harm me because, in his words, I was just a worthless failure. Another time, we got into an argument. I don't even remember what it was about. Probably something trivial. In the end, he told me he wished I'd die. I could easily ignore his other insults, but that hurt because I was struggling with mental health issues at the time. I'm doing better now, but it was awful to hear my own brother wish me dead. Dad was often at work, and mom didn't seem to care. Once, she even yelled at me, claiming I was to blame for provoking him by playing with him and irritating him. Episode 2. Escalation and father's intervention. Things got worse. In high school, Caleb tried to set my hair on fire. The most shocking part, mom took his side, saying he was just playing. Who plays like that, seriously? Thankfully, dad finally stepped in and pointed out that he and mom had serious issues. He threatened to call the police on Caleb, which was a sobering moment. I never thought Dad would take my side because he always said how much Caleb resembled him while we were growing up. But Dad told me he'd been tolerating Caleb for years, hoping he was just an immature kid, but he was starting to realize Caleb was becoming a real Kyver. Hearing that from Dad brought me such relief that I nearly cried. I confessed everything to him, what Caleb had done to me over the years. Even the bullying at school. Dad was shocked that I'd been through so much. The next day, he went to the school and spoke to the principal to warn my bullies about serious consequences if they continued. That same evening, He signed me up for Emma classes at a local gym. He said I needed to get stronger and learn to stand up to the bullies in my life. I'll admit, for a nerd like me, learning to fight probably looked funny. But like everything in life, I approached it with full dedication. I made time to train every day and attend Emma classes. I don't want to brag, but it completely changed my life and my physical fitness. One day, Caleb was up to his old tricks again. He stole my pocket money, which we got for helping our parents around the house. I'd been saving it for a while. Caleb snuck into my room and took the money. I caught him as he was about to ride off with his friends on his bike. I firmly told him to give my money back because he knew stealing was wrong. But Caleb just smirked and said all I could do was tattle the dag. I don't know what came over me, but I punched Caleb in the face. He was so shocked that he fell off his bike. I hit him again and threw him to the ground. Caleb started crying loudly, like a little kid. It was comical to see a teenager sobbing on the ground. But Mom ran out of the house, heaving her baby cry, to help him and find out what happened. When she learned I'd fought with him, she was surprised and then started scolding me. She said that as the older brother, I should teach Caleb good things. Caleb seemed to enjoy watching me get reprimanded. One also complained to Dad about me beating Caleb, saying I needed to be controlled. Dad seriously asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how Caleb stole the money I'd honestly earned and saved, while Caleb tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date and that I, as his brother, should help. But Dad told Caleb he was lucky I only hit him for stealing someone else might have called the police. Dad went on to tell Caleb he had no right to take other people's things without permission. Caleb didn't like that and started throwing a tantrum, probably hoping Mom would back him up. But Dad stood firm. When Caleb realized I wouldn't be punished for hitting him, he screamed about how much he hated me, ran to his room, and locked the door. After that incident, Caleb started keeping his distance from me. He finally understood he couldn't bully me anymore, and even Dad didn't support his antics. For the first time in a long while, I felt we were equal. Although he couldn't physically harm me anymore, he still tried to hurt me with words when he knew our parents weren't around. Episode 3. Growing resentment and moving out. With each year, things got worse. It seemed like the older Caleb got, the angrier and more volatile he became. If I approached him with a question, he'd just ignore me and leave the room, whispering that I was a nerd and a loser. If he wanted to tell me something, he'd only do it through Mom, who'd relay his messages. I asked Mom why Caleb couldn't just talk to me directly if he needed something, and she told me to be more understanding. I didn't know if this was just a teenage phase and I needed to wait it out, or if he truly hated me. I used to be able to handle what he said, but at some point, I just wanted to move out to escape this poison. I repeatedly asked Mom to arrange a conversation so we could talk things out, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. I even asked her opinion on why Caleb treated me this way, but she just brushed off the question. In the end, I left for the university I dreamed of attending. I was an excellent student and even got a scholarship. Dad threw a party in my honor, and Mom turned out to be proud of me too, but Caleb remained distant. Episode 4. University and Marriage. I felt a mix of excitement for the future and relief at escaping the toxic environment at home. The first few months at university were liberating. I made lots of friends, enjoyed my classes, and started building a life without the oppressive atmosphere home. The fear of Caleb's verbal attacks disappeared, and I experienced a new sense of peace. In my second year, I started dating my future wife, Karen. We were introduced by a friend at a fraternity party, and we hit it off right away. Since I came from a religious family, having children before marriage was absolutely unacceptable. So when we found out Karen was pregnant in our final year, it pushed us to get married right after graduation. Our wedding was small but beautiful, with a lovely ceremony. My parents were happy for us, and we had a great time. At the time, I thought Karen was the love of my life. I always believed in monogamy, one woman to spend my life with. Even though other women showed interest in me over the years, I never looked elsewhere because I was genuinely happy in my marriage. Karen was perfect to me, and I never wanted to hurt her. But over the years of our marriage, I discovered twice that she was cheating on me. One was with a married colleague at work, with whom she had an on-again, off-again affair for several years. The other was with an ex-boyfriend from high school when she visited her family in another state. I'm sure some might call me a fool, and looking back, I can't deny it. After periods of separation in both cases, I decided to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise a child in a broken family, and I truly believed we could overcome these challenges. We were pretty young when the situation with her colleague happened, so I chalked it up to youthful mistakes and impulsive actions. For a while, things seemed normal. I couldn't fully trust her anymore, but I tried my best to push my doubts aside because I knew that if I chose forgiveness, I needed to move forward and start fresh. 4 years had passed since her second affair, and I felt I'd made the right decision by giving her a chance to prove she still wanted to be in our marriage. Over the years, Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, planning our family's future. Episode 5: The Ultimate Betrayal. But 3 months ago, my reality was shattered again by an incident that, in my opinion, was far worse than the previous ones. Karen confessed that she'd been sleeping with another man for a long time and hinted that our son might not even be mine. Hearing those words, I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. A mix of shock, betrayal, and confusion overwhelmed me. I tried to grasp the magnitude of what she'd just told me. In a daze, I asked her why she'd hidden such an important secret and how she could do something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent. She seemed detached, almost uncaring about the pain she'd caused. Her answers were vague, leaving me with more questions than answers. I kept pressing Karen to tell me the truth because I felt I deserved to know who the father of my child was since I'd been raising our son from the start. Finally, she admitted it was Caleb. My eyes widened in shock, and I asked her what exactly she meant. That's when Karen told me she and Caleb had become friends after I introduced her to my family when she visited us for Thanksgiving and stayed until New Year's. I remember Caleb, who was usually cold to me, being quite polite and friendly with her. I was glad about that because I didn't want Karen to feel unwelcome. She wanted to be accepted into my family, so she often spent time with my mom. She noticed that Caleb and I weren't close and asked me about it. I finally opened up to her and told her that my brother and I would probably never get along. Karen understood, but she started including Caleb in our plans. For example, when we'd watch a movie, she'd invite Caleb and we'd watch whatever he wanted. I think at the time, Caleb and I were talking a bit more, which was significant progress compared to his years of ignoring me. I remember Karine and Caleb sometimes playing video games together, but I didn't think much of it. Karen told me that one day, Caleb opened up to her about his struggles and a recent breakup with a girlfriend. He was so vulnerable with her, and they became friends. She said he'd sometimes innocently flirt with her when I wasn't around, and obviously, things went too far, and she couldn't hold back anymore. I closed my eyes as my imagination painted a picture of my wife and brother sleeping together, and I nearly threw up. She said she felt guilty afterward and ran away from him. That was true because my girlfriend suddenly said she wanted to go home. I thought she'd stay with me for New Year's. I tried to convince her to stay, but she insisted she had to leave. After the holidays, when we met again at college after classes started, she was as cheerful as ever, and I didn't suspect a thing. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Now, Karen told me she didn't know who the real father was, me or Caleb, and that she had no way of finding out. Since I'd already taken responsibility, she knew I was the more reliable brother, so she decided to stay with me. That's why we got married. I felt like my world was collapsing around me. The son I loved and spent countless hours with might not even be mine. I asked her if she was still seeing Caleb, and she slowly nodded. Karen told me she and Caleb had always kept in touch because there was an undeniable chemistry between them. They'd sneak off to hotels when she lied to me about working overtime. She admitted that half her business trips were just romantic getaways. I asked her why she even married me if she really wanted my brother. Karen replied that she didn't want to be the one to ruin a marriage, and seeing what a good father I was to our son, she stayed with me all these years. She said she made a mistake and didn't know how to stop. I just told Karen I was glad she told me the truth and that I was going to pack my things and move out. Karen started crying and begging for forgiveness, saying I should be yelling at her and getting angry, not calmly planning my next step. I silently went to the closet and started packing my things into a suitcase. Karen kept repeating that if I really loved her, I'd at least try to fight for her, and that mistakes happen in every marriage. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, she changed tactics and started talking about how a divorce would affect our son and that kids shouldn't grow up in a broken family. I reminded her that I might not even be his father, which brought her to tears. She started yelling at me, accusing me of being cruel and saying I couldn't just walk away despite being with the child since his birth. It seemed my wife thought there was nothing that could make me leave her. I think that's partly my fault because I let a lot of things slide in the past. Episode 6. Confronting Caleb and Family Fallout. Even though I still had some feelings for her, they mostly came from the fact that I thought we had a son together. Karen kept insisting it wasn't too late and that we could fix everything, but I could barely believe that. I felt I didn't have the strength to deal with this anymore. Even if I forgave her, I'd never be able to forget that she slept with my own brother. I've always believed people can make mistakes and be forgiven because we're all imperfect, but this crossed every line. I left her crying at the door and drove to a hotel. The next day, I went to my parents and told them everything about my wife's affair with Caleb. The shock on their faces was obvious. My mother, as expected, first tried to defend Caleb, saying it couldn't be true because her boy would never do something like that to his brother. Determined to reveal the truth, I asked my parents to stay silent and let me call Caleb in front of them. I asked them not to make a sound because I thought it might catch Caleb off guard. I wanted him to think it was just a private conversation between us, so he might lower his defense. When Caleb answered the call, I got straight to the point and confronted him with the facts about his affair with my wife. At first, he denied it outright and refused to admit anything. But when I told him Karen had confessed everything, he started blaming her, calling her immoral. He said he wasn't to blame if women wanted him and that he was the more attractive brother. I firmly told him I was going to expose him to everyone. Caleb started laughing and said no one would believe me because he was the golden child. I smirked at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth, since our parents had heard every word. Caleb fell silent, then started stammering, trying to justify himself and save his reputation. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation from Caleb. He mumbled pathetic attempts to justify his actions, blaming everyone but himself and desperately trying to pin the blame on Karen. I saw my mother, who once defended her favorite son, now feeling a mix of disappointment and anger. For years, I'd endured Caleb's bullying, and now the truth was out and the roles had reversed. Caleb and his actions were fully exposed. As Caleb's words started to falter, my father, who's usually reserved with his emotions, couldn't hide his disappointment. Caleb, he began, his voice full of condemnation, what you did isn't just a betrayal of your brother, it's a betrayal of the entire family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued doing it even after their marriage. Your actions have consequences, and they've irreversibly destroyed the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to understand that family, loyalty, and decency are the most important values. But today, you've violated everything I tried to teach you. He paused to let Caleb feel the weight of his words. Your disregard for your brother's feelings, your lack of respect for his marriage, it's unacceptable. You didn't just hurt him, you ruined our relationship with you. I feel that your mother and I are to blame for who you've become, and we can't let you go unpunished. You'll have to handle your tuition payments on your own. I'm also no longer funding your lifestyle. You think you'll become a man by having affairs with married women? Well, let's see what happens when you have no one to rely on financially. I stayed calm, though I initially wanted to yell at Caleb. Watching my father punish him was the best way for me to find satisfaction. I'd exposed his true face, and it was clear he'd underestimated the consequences. Caleb kept protesting and justifying his actions, but Dad abruptly ended the call, cutting off his pathetic attempt. My mom came over and hugged me. It had been a long time since we'd had a moment like that, but in that embrace, there was unspoken support and understanding. She apologized for not believing me all this time. I thought to myself that the 14-year-old me could never have imagined this moment being supported and hugged like that. Episode 7. Divorce and moving forward. After that, Dad helped me find a good lawyer to divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to play dirty, demanding alimony from me since I earned more than her, but her infidelity worked in my favor. We also did a paternity test, and it turned out Caleb was indeed the child's father. I can't put into words how hard it was to process that news. It was even worse than when Karen confessed to the affair. I was so angry that the child wasn't mine, but I decided to stay strong despite everything. Karen begged me to keep visiting our son, saying he shouldn't be punished for her actions, but I just couldn't see him. He reminded me of Caleb, and I hated that. After our divorce was finalized and I was finally free, I moved into my own bachelor apartment. It was strange living alone since I'd married very young and had never lived on my own. But since I'd always been independent, I quickly adjusted to living alone, and honestly, I grew to love it. 2 weeks ago, Dad called me to say he was considering changing his will because he didn't want Caleb to inherit anything. If there's one thing you need to know about my dad, it's that he's incredibly stubborn. Since he decided he wanted nothing to do with Caleb, he kept his word. Caleb tried to reconnect with our parents and even showed up at their house, begging for forgiveness, but they didn't even let him in the door. My mother, who usually gave in to his whims, seemed completely done with him too, though it probably hurt her the most. Caleb never once reached out to me to apologize for what he did, so he clearly didn't regret anything. He was just upset that our parents wouldn't talk to him. Dad told me that in his will, he'd leave the entire inheritance to me to ensure Caleb couldn't claim anything later. He'd leave Caleb just $1. I was shocked because my dad had worked hard his whole life. With his assets, pension fund, and life insurance, the total would be nearly $2 million. The only condition in the will was that if Dad passed away before Mom, she'd continue living in their house, though ownership would transfer to me. Of course, I was fine with that. I'd want to take care of Mom until her last days. I don't know how, but Caleb found out about it. Since he couldn't get through to our parents, he called me yesterday trying to mend our relationship. He told me how hard it was to pay for college, and after Karen found out the child was his, she started demanding child support. He said he had no money and was looking for a part-time job but couldn't find anything. I started laughing and told him I'd had enough and that he should have thought about all this before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. Caleb argued that I was being unfair and that she was to blame too. I agreed and reminded him that I divorced her and now she was his responsibility. So he shouldn't call me to complain about her or the child. These were the consequences of his own action. Caleb started raising his voice, but I cut him off and reminded him that he was no longer the family favorite, but the black sheep who slept with his own brother's wife. At that moment, Caleb started crying and said all our relatives, including our grandparents, were pressuring him, but I didn't care anymore. I told him we were done and that he should never call me again because I was no longer his brother. Episode 8. Reflection and question and question. Since then, I've been replaying that conversation in my head over and over. Even though I hate my brother, I'd never heard him cry, at least not since we grew up. I won't lie, it hurt a little to see him so helpless. So I'm here to ask, should I talk to my parents about him? And would I be the asshole if I don't? Update 1. Why I don't see my son. Hi everyone. Many of you have asked why I no longer see my son, Henry, and some in the comments even called me cruel. I'm sorry to say this, but I don't want to raise someone else's child. This isn't a case of a stepchild in this case. I was made to believe he was my son, only to find out he's actually my brother. Of course, it hurt, and I cried about it for days. But the reason I don't want to see Henry anymore is that I don't want to see Karen in my life. If I stay in touch with her child, she'll find a way to worm her way back into my life, and I don't want that. You can call me cruel or selfish, but I can't see him, at least not anytime soon. Update 2. Family dynamics after the fallout. Most of you correctly guessed that it was my mom who told Caleb about the will. Caleb called me out of desperation, trying to fix things. I confronted my mom about this in front of Dad, and she broke down crying. She said I'd already punished Caleb enough and that he'd learn his lesson. My dad firmly told her that if she thought Caleb's actions could be forgiven, he couldn't live with her anymore because he'd never forgive Caleb for such a betrayal. That threat made Mom go quiet. Dad made it clear that if she spoke to Caleb again and we found out, she'd have to pack her things and leave him. As I've said, my dad is a very stubborn man. I hope Mom has learned her lesson. Update 3. 5 months later. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved over the past few months. Dan and I now go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like a friend than a father. The last I heard about Caleb, he and Karen are now living together. Caleb even has a job. He works part-time as a mechanic. Apparently, they're raising Henry together, which is probably a good thing. In conversations with my parents, I never mentioned Caleb. I got a promotion at work 2 months ago, so my salary has increased significantly. I'm not dating anyone right now because I feel I still need time. I've started seeing a therapist, so we'll see if that helps.